Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation. Clark Winter had built his life on two principles: loyalty and control. At 35, he commanded respect in the construction industry, having transformed his father's small contracting business into Winter and Associates, a multi-million-dollar empire specializing in luxury developments. His reputation was carved in steel and concrete, a man who delivered on promises and never forgot those who crossed him. Clark's marriage to Anna Adams had been a calculated alliance as much as it was love. Anna, 28, came from old money. The Adams family owned significant real estate throughout the state. Her inheritance would eventually merge with his business acumen, creating an unstoppable force. She was beautiful, intelligent, and carried herself with the grace expected of someone from her background. Their son, baby Marcus, had arrived 3 months ago, cementing what Clark believed was their perfect future. Anna had insisted on staying home to care for their child, and Clark had agreed, seeing it as another symbol of his success. His wife didn't need to work. But Clark's past had taught him that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. His own father, Ernest Winter, had built the original Winter construction through backbreaking work, only to be betrayed by his business partner who had embezzled funds and disappeared. Ernest had died of a heart attack fighting the legal battles, leaving 16-year-old Clark to witness how betrayal could destroy everything. That experience had forged Clark into someone who planned for every contingency. He had installed discreet security systems throughout their home, monitored their finances obsessively, and maintained detailed records of everything. Anna thought it was his business mind. She had no idea it was his survival instinct. The baby's 3-month checkup was routine, or so Clark thought. Dr. Russell Riley had been their family physician for years, a man Clark trusted implicitly. When Dr. Riley's nurse, Valerie Bradshaw, called Clark into a separate room, her face was grave. "Sir, this is urgent," Dr. Riley said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who usually takes care of your baby during the day?" "I work, so my wife watches him," Clark replied, confusion creeping into his voice. Dr. Riley lowered his voice further, glancing toward the door. "You need to leave that house now because your son shows signs of systematic neglect and possible sedation. The blood work reveals trace amounts of children's sleep medication in dangerous concentrations. Someone has been drugging your child." The words hit Clark like a sledgehammer. The room seemed to tilt, but his mind immediately shifted into the cold, calculating mode that had served him in business. "Are you certain? I've been practicing for 20 years. These aren't accidental doses. Someone has been deliberately keeping this baby sedated for extended periods. The muscle development delays, the unusual sleeping patterns you mentioned, it all makes sense now." Clark's hands clenched into fists. "What else?" "There are other concerns. Diaper rash that's been left untreated for days. Signs of dehydration. This baby has been severely neglected while appearing to be cared for superficially. I need copies of everything. Blood work, your notes, all of it." Dr. Riley nodded. "I'm obligated to report this to Child Protective Services." "Give me 12 hours, Clark said, his voice deadly calm. "Then make your report." Dr. Riley studied Clark's face and nodded slowly. He'd known Clark since he was a teenager dealing with his father's death. He recognized the look in Clark's eyes. It was the same expression Ernest Winter had worn when he discovered his partner's betrayal. Clark left the medical office with copies of the blood work hidden in his jacket. His mind was already working, piecing together the signs he'd missed. Anna's insistence that the baby was a good sleeper. Her frequent naps during the day when he called home. The baby's unusual lethargy that she'd attributed to normal infant behavior. But who was she hiding the baby's condition from, and why? The answer began forming in Clark's mind, and it burned like acid. Instead of going home, Clark drove to his office and began making calls. His first was to Dennis Hyde, a private investigator who specialized in domestic surveillance. Dennis had worked several cases for Clark's business, investigating potential business partners and employees. "I need everything on my wife," Clark said without preamble. "Everything. Clark, are you sure about this? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. As Clark sat in his office that night, staring out at the city lights, he made a promise to himself and to his son. Whatever Anna had done, whoever she was protecting by drugging their child, they would all pay. And Clark Winter never forgot a debt. Chapter 2. The Discovery. Dennis Hyde's preliminary report arrived within 48 hours, delivered personally to Clark's office after hours. Dennis, a former police detective with 20 years of experience, had seen everything, but the photos he spread across Clark's desk made even him uncomfortable. Your wife has been leaving the house every day between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m., Dennis began, his voice professional but strained. She doses the baby with liquid sleep medication around 9:30, waits for him to become unresponsive, then leaves. Clark studied the photographs with the same detached focus he applied to construction blueprints. Anna leaving their home. Anna entering a downtown apartment building. Anna in intimate embraces with a man Clark recognized. Luther Lindsay, Clark said, his voice flat. You know him? Clark leaned back in his chair. Luther Lindsay was Anna's college boyfriend, a man from a wealthy family who worked in high-end real estate development. Clark had met him at several social functions, had even done business with Lindsay Development Group. Luther was charismatic, handsome in an entitled way, and had always looked at Anna with barely concealed desire. They've been together since 2 weeks after the baby was born, Dennis continued. The apartment belongs to Luther. Based on the surveillance, they're not just having an affair, they're planning something bigger. Dennis pulled out additional photos showing Anna and Luther with legal documents, meeting with lawyers, reviewing what appeared to be financial papers. I managed to get close enough to hear fragments of conversation. They're discussing asset division, custody arrangements, and something about a timeline. Your wife isn't just cheating, Clark. She's building a case to take everything. Clark's expression never changed, but Dennis noticed his hands had gone completely still. In all their years of working together, Dennis had learned that Clark's stillness was more dangerous than most men's rage. There's more, Dennis said. I followed Luther to his family's estate last weekend. He met with his father, William Lindsay, and their family attorney. The Lindsay family has been planning this for months. Clark finally spoke. What kind of planning? They want your business connections, your development contracts, and Anna's inheritance. With a divorce, they get access to the Adams family real estate portfolio through Anna, and they're positioning to acquire several of your ongoing projects during the settlement. The pieces were falling into place with brutal clarity. Anna's sudden desire to stay home with the baby. Her insistence on specific sleeping schedules that kept Clark from spending extended time with his son. Her renewed contact with old friends from college. The baby, Clark said quietly. They needed him out of the picture during their meetings. The sedation serves 2 purposes. It keeps him quiet so they can meet undisturbed, and it creates evidence of an unfit mother for custody battles. They're planning to claim postpartum depression affected Anna's judgment, making her an unreliable witness while painting you as an absent father. Clark stood and walked to his office window. Below, the city continued its nightly rhythm, unaware that Clark Winter's world had just reshuffled into something entirely new. How long do we have? Based on what I overheard, they're planning to initiate divorce proceedings within the month. Anna's been documenting your work hours, building a case that you're an absent father. Luther's family has connections in family court. Clark turned from the window. I need you to expand surveillance. I want to know everything. Their schedules, their contacts, their plans, their weaknesses. Everyone involved. Clark, what are you thinking? I'm thinking, Clark said, his voice carrying the same tone he used when negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts, that they've made a critical error in judgment. They've assumed I'm the same kind of man as Luther, privileged, soft, playing by rules that protect the wealthy. Dennis had worked enough cases to recognize the look in Clark's eyes. And you're not. I built my business from nothing, Dennis. I've dealt with corrupt contractors, crooked city officials, and competitors who try to sabotage my projects. Anna and Luther think this is about money and property. Clark's smile was cold. They have no idea what they've actually started. What do you need from me? Everything. Financial records, communication logs, family connections, business relationships, personal habits, security details. I want to know what they eat for breakfast and who they talk to about it. As Dennis packed up the surveillance photos, Clark made another call. Salvatore Bond? It's Clark Winter. I need to discuss a specialized construction project. Very specialized. Salvatore Bond owned Bond Security, a company that provided high-end security services for Clark's construction projects. But Salvatore's background was more complex. Former military, connections throughout the city's infrastructure, and a reputation for solving problems that required creative solutions. When can you meet? Clark asked. Tonight, if you need. I need. After Dennis left, Clark sat alone in his office, surrounded by the evidence of his wife's betrayal. But instead of anger, he felt something colder, more focused. Anna and Luther had made the mistake of threatening his son, his heir, his future, his bloodline. They were about to learn that Clark Winter didn't just build structures that lasted. He built consequences that lasted even longer. Chapter 3. The Architect of Ruin. Salvatore Bond arrived at Clark's office at midnight, his presence filling the room with the quiet intensity of a man accustomed to violence. Salvatore was built like a concrete pillar, solid, immovable, and essential to structures that needed to last. His security company was legitimate, but his methods often ventured into gray areas that regular law enforcement couldn't touch. Tell me, Salvatore said, settling into the chair across from Clark's desk. Clark laid out the situation with the precision of an architect reading blueprints. Anna's affair, the systematic drugging of their son, the planned destruction of his business and reputation. Salvatore listened without interruption, his dark eyes processing every detail. They think they're playing chess, Clark included, but they're actually sitting on a construction site, and I'm about to bring down the building. Salvatore leaned forward. What do you need? Luther Lindsay thinks he's untouchable because of his family name. I need to know every way he's vulnerable. Personally, professionally, legally. Same with Anna. I want pressure points. And then, Clark's expression never changed. Then I apply pressure until everything they've built collapses. Over the next week, Salvatore's network began feeding Clark information that painted a detailed portrait of his enemies. Luther Lindsay was more than entitled. He was reckless. His real estate deals often skirted legal boundaries. He had gambling debts his family covered up, and he had a cocaine habit that he fed through connections in the nightclub scene. Anna's background revealed different vulnerabilities. Her inheritance was tied up in a trust that required moral character clauses. Adultery could forfeit her claim to the Adams family fortune. More importantly, her family had a history of mental health issues that she'd hidden from Clark. Her grandmother had been institutionalized, her mother had struggled with prescription drug addiction, and Anna herself had been treated for anxiety and depression in college. There's something else, Salvatore reported during their third meeting. Luther's father, William Lindsay, has been using insider information from city planning meetings to buy property ahead of development announcements. It's not technically illegal, but it's unethical enough to destroy his reputation. Clark absorbed this information like a computer processing data. Timeline. Luther's cocaine dealer is a man named Young Shea, who also supplies several high-profile clients. Young Shea has been under DEA surveillance for 6 months. Luther's credit cards show payments to cash advance services that match Young Shea's operation timing. And Anna, her medical records show she's been getting anxiety medication from 3 different doctors without cross-referencing. It's prescription fraud, possibly addiction. The same medication she's been using on your son. Clark stood and walked to his office safe, removing a thick folder. I've been documenting every aspect of our marriage, our finances, and our business relationships. Anna thinks I'm obsessive about record keeping. She doesn't realize I've been building a fortress. He spread documents across his desk. Financial records showing Anna's unexplained absences from their joint accounts. Security footage from their home showing her leaving during times she claimed to be caring for the baby. Medical records documenting the baby's unusual symptoms that Anna had attributed to normal development. She's been building a case against me, Clark continued, but she's also been creating evidence against herself. Every lie can be documented. Every deception can be proven. Salvatore studied the documents. You're not just planning to defend yourself. You're planning to destroy them. They threatened my son. They drugged an infant to facilitate adultery and theft. Clark's voice dropped to a whisper. There is no forgiveness for that. There's only consequence. What's the plan? Clark pulled out architectural drawings, but these weren't for buildings. They were flowcharts showing relationships, timelines, and pressure points. He'd approached his revenge like a construction project, with phases, milestones, and structural dependencies. Phase 1. Isolation. Luther's cocaine habit becomes public knowledge. His family's insider trading becomes a scandal. Anna's prescription fraud and adultery surface. Their support systems collapse. Phase 2. Financial pressure. Luther's debts are called in simultaneously. Anna's inheritance is challenged based on the moral character clauses. Their liquid assets are tied up in legal proceedings. Phase 3. Legal consequences. The evidence of child endangerment ensures Anna loses custody permanently. Luther's drug connections lead to criminal charges. Their reputations are destroyed beyond repair. Salvatore was quiet for a long moment. In Phase 4, Clark's smile was arctic. Phase 4 is when they realized that everything they thought they knew about Clark Winter was wrong. That the successful businessman they tried to manipulate was just the surface. Underneath is something much more dangerous. What do you need me to do? Young Shea is going to have a very bad week. His operation is going to be exposed, his client list is going to become public, and Luther Lindsay's name is going to be at the top of that list. That can be arranged. Anna's multiple doctors are going to discover her prescription fraud simultaneously. Her family's lawyer is going to receive detailed documentation of her adultery and child endangerment. Also manageable. Clark leaned back in his chair, and William Lindsay is going to find out that his insider trading activities have been documented and that evidence has been provided to federal investigators. Salvatore stood to leave, then paused. Clark, once this starts, there's no going back. These people are going to be destroyed. Good, Clark said simply. They should have thought about that before they threatened my son. As Salvatore left, Clark remained in his office, surrounded by the plans for his wife's destruction. He felt no anger now. Anger was a luxury he couldn't afford. What he felt was purpose, cold and focused, and absolutely certain. Anna and Luther had made the mistake of thinking Clark Winter was just another wealthy businessman who would accept being cheated and stolen from. They were about to learn that underneath the expensive suits and corporate success was something much older, much harder, and completely without mercy. The construction of their ruin was about to begin. Chapter 4. The demolition begins. The first crack in Luther Lindsay's world appeared on a Tuesday morning when young Shea was arrested during a federal drug raid. The DEA had received an anonymous tip about his operation, complete with detailed records of transactions, client lists, and distribution schedules. Luther's name appeared in those records 47 times over the past 6 months. Clark watched the morning news coverage from his office, sipping coffee as reporters detailed the extensive drug network serving wealthy clientele. Luther's photograph appeared on screen as a person of interest, though charges hadn't been filed yet. Clark's phone rang. Dennis Hyde. It's starting, Dennis reported. Luther's father is in emergency meetings with lawyers. Anna called Luther 6 times this morning. He's not answering. And Anna, panicking. She tried to reach her family lawyer, but he's in meetings with her trustees. The Adams family received a detailed report about her activities yesterday. Clark had personally delivered that report to Grace Adams Pugh, Anna's grandmother and the primary trustee of the Adams family fortune. Grace was 83, sharp as a blade, and had built the family's real estate empire through decades of calculated decisions. When Clark had presented evidence of Anna's adultery, child endangerment, and prescription fraud, Grace's response had been swift and brutal. Anna's inheritance is frozen pending investigation, Clark said. That gives us control of the timeline. By afternoon, the second wave hit. William Lindsay's insider trading activities became the subject of a federal investigation when detailed documentation was provided to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The evidence was comprehensive. Phone records, property purchases, timeline correlations between city planning meetings and land acquisitions. Luther's cocaine arrest became inevitable when young Shay, facing federal charges, provided full cooperation with investigators. The DEA raid on Luther's apartment yielded enough evidence to support trafficking charges, not just possession. Anna's prescription fraud unraveled when Dr. Riley contacted the state medical board about discrepancies in her medical records. 3 different doctors had prescribed anxiety medication without coordinating care, creating a pattern of drug-seeking behavior that extended to her treatment of the baby. Clark's phone buzzed with a text from Anna. "We need to talk." "Emergency." He ignored it. By evening, Clark was ready for phase 2. He drove home for the first time in a week, parking in the driveway of the house he'd bought for his perfect family. Anna's car was gone. She was probably with Luther, trying to manage the crisis they didn't yet understand was just beginning. Clark entered through the front door and headed straight to the nursery. Baby Marcus was awake, alert in a way Clark hadn't seen in months. The baby's eyes tracked movement normally, and when Clark picked him up, Marcus didn't immediately fall asleep. "Hey there, son," Clark whispered. "Daddy's going to make sure no one ever hurts you again." Clark spent 2 hours with his son, feeding him, changing him, and documenting his normal responses on video. The contrast with Anna's descriptions of a lethargic, difficult baby was stark and damning. When Anna returned home at 10 p.m., she found Clark in the living room, baby Marcus sleeping peacefully in his arms. "Clark, we need to talk about how you've been drugging our son." Clark's voice was conversational, almost gentle. Anna's face went white. "I don't know what you mean." Dr. Riley explained everything. Blood work, medical records, the systematic sedation. "I know about Luther. I know about the affair. I know about your plans to destroy me and take everything." Anna's composure cracked. "It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think." Clark stood, still holding the baby. "You drugged our infant son to facilitate adultery and theft. You endangered a baby's life for sex and money." "I never hurt him. He was always crying, and you needed to meet your lover. So you poisoned our child." Anna's eyes darted around the room, looking for escape or explanation. "Luther and I, we're in love. We were together before you, and you decided to destroy our marriage through fraud, theft, and child abuse." "It's not fraud. The money is mine by right, and you never hear anyway." Clark's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness made Anna step backward. "Anna, you've made several critical errors in judgment. First, you assumed I was weak enough to be destroyed by your pathetic scheme. Second, you assumed I wouldn't discover your activities. Third, you assumed there would be consequences only for me." "What do you mean?" "I mean," Clark said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "that you and Luther have awakened something in me that neither of you were prepared to handle." Anna's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and paled further. "Luther's been arrested." "Yes. Federal drug charges. Cocaine trafficking. He's looking at 10 to 15 years. But this isn't supposed to. This is exactly what's supposed to happen when people threaten my family. Luther is finished. His father is facing federal investigation. You're about to lose your inheritance and your freedom. You can't do this. I'm your wife." Clark looked down at baby Marcus, who was sleeping peacefully against his chest. "You stopped being my wife when you drugged our son. Now you're just an enemy who happens to live in my house. I'll fight you. I'll take Marcus, and you'll do nothing." Clark's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Because tomorrow, you're going to be arrested for child endangerment, prescription fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft. The evidence is comprehensive and irrefutable." Anna sank into a chair, the reality of her situation finally penetrating her panic. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand that actions have consequences. I want you to realize that you've destroyed your life for a man who won't even take your phone calls from prison. I want you to know that every day for the rest of your life, you'll remember the moment you decided to harm our son." Clark stood and headed toward the nursery. "Pack whatever you can carry. You have 20 minutes before I call the police." "Clark, please." 20 minutes, Anna. Use them wisely. As Anna scrambled to gather her belongings, Clark placed Marcus in his crib and activated the video monitoring system. Tomorrow, Child Protective Services would interview him as part of their investigation, but tonight, he wanted to spend time with his son in peace. Through the baby monitor, he could hear Anna sobbing as she packed. But Clark felt no sympathy. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, threatened something that could never be forgiven. The demolition of Anna and Luther's world was just beginning. Chapter 5. The Crushing Weight. 3 weeks after Anna's arrest, Clark sat in the family court waiting room with his son, preparing for the custody hearing that would determine Marcus's future. Baby Marcus had gained weight, his color had improved, and his development had accelerated once the systematic sedation ended. Dr. Riley's medical reports documented the dramatic improvement, creating a stark contrast with Anna's claims of postpartum depression affecting her judgment. Anna entered the courtroom in handcuffs, her appearance transformed by 3 weeks in county lockup. Her designer clothes had been replaced by an orange jumpsuit. Her carefully maintained hair hung limp and unwashed, and her eyes held the hollow look of someone whose world had collapsed completely. Judge Nelson Meade reviewed the case files with the methodical attention of a man who had seen every variation of family destruction. The evidence was overwhelming. Medical records showing the baby's systematic sedation, financial records documenting Anna's fraud, surveillance footage proving her abandonment of Marcus for extended periods. Mrs. Winter, Judge Meade said, "You stand accused of child endangerment, prescription fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft. How do you plead?" Anna's court-appointed attorney whispered urgently in her ear before she responded. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Clark's attorney, Eric Saunders, one of the state's most respected family law practitioners, methodically presented the evidence. Blood work showing dangerous levels of sleep medication in baby Marcus. Medical records from 3 different doctors Anna had used to obtain prescription drugs. Financial records showing her systematic theft from joint accounts to fund her affair. The surveillance evidence was particularly damning. Video footage showed Anna leaving the house for hours at a time, leaving Marcus alone and sedated. Her phone records correlated perfectly with Luther's, showing coordinated schedules for their meetings. "Your Honor," Eric said, "Mr. Winter has been the victim of a systematic campaign of fraud, theft, and child abuse. His wife drugged their infant son to facilitate adultery and planned theft of Mr. Winter's business assets. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a months-long conspiracy." Anna's attorney attempted a defense based on postpartum depression, but the medical evidence contradicted any claims of mental illness affecting judgment. Anna had been lucid enough to coordinate complex plans with Luther, manage multiple fraudulent medical relationships, and systematically document Clark's business activities for their planned theft. Judge Meade's decision was swift. Custody of Marcus Winter is awarded solely to the father. Mrs. Winter's parental rights are suspended pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. Mrs. Winter is prohibited from any contact with the minor child. Anna collapsed in her chair, the reality of losing her son crushing her remaining composure. But Clark felt no satisfaction, only the cold certainty that justice was being served. Outside the courthouse, Dennis Hyde was waiting with an update on Luther's situation. Federal prosecutors offered him a plea deal, Dennis reported. 20 years for full cooperation in his father's insider trading case. And he's refusing. His family's lawyers think they can beat the charges. Clark considered this information. Luther's refusal to cooperate meant he still believed his family's wealth and connections could save him. It was time to demonstrate how wrong he was. What about his father? William Lindsay is facing federal indictment next week. The SEC investigation found evidence of systematic insider trading going back 5 years. He's looking at criminal charges and civil penalties that will bankrupt the family. Clark nodded. The Lindsay family's destruction was proceeding according to plan, but Luther's continued defiance required a more personal approach. That evening, Clark visited Salvatore Bond at his security company offices. Salvatore's business operated from a converted warehouse, It's legitimate security operations providing cover for more specialized services. Luther thinks his family money will protect him, Clark explained. He needs to understand how powerless he actually is. What did you have in mind? Clark pulled out a folder containing detailed financial analysis of the Lindsay family assets. Their wealth is built on reputation and credit. Real estate investments, development projects, social connections. All of it can be destroyed through systematic pressure. Meaning, every bank that holds Lindsay family mortgages receives detailed evidence of Williams' insider trading. Every business partner gets documentation of the family's federal investigation. Every social connection learns about Luther's drug trafficking and child endangerment conspiracy. Salvatore studied the documents. Social and financial isolation. Complete isolation. The Lindsay name becomes toxic in every circle they've ever moved in. Their credit disappears. Their business relationships collapse. Their social standing evaporates. And Luther? Clark's expression hardened. Luther is going to spend his 20-year prison sentence understanding exactly how much he lost when he decided to threaten my family. Over the following week, the Lindsay family's social and financial destruction accelerated. Their country club memberships were revoked when detailed evidence of their federal investigation surfaced. Business partners canceled contracts and development deals when the scope of Williams' insider trading became known. Luther's arrest photos and drug trafficking charges became front-page news in the society publications the Lindsay family had once dominated. Every charity board, social organization, and business association they belonged to quietly distanced themselves from the family name. But Clark's most devastating blow was personal. He arranged for Luther to receive daily updates about Anna's deteriorating condition in county lockup, her prescription drug withdrawal, her complete social isolation, her family's disownment. Luther was forced to confront that his affair had destroyed the woman he claimed to love. She's facing 10 years minimum. Clark had Dennis report to Luther through his attorney. Child endangerment with systematic drug abuse. The judge is recommending maximum sentencing. Luther's response was a desperate plea for contact with Anna, which Clark blocked through legal channels. Luther would serve his sentence knowing that his actions had condemned Anna to a decade of imprisonment and that their affair had destroyed both their lives. Clark's final meeting with Anna came before her sentencing hearing. She was barely recognizable. The withdrawal from prescription medications had left her gaunt and hollow-eyed. Her legal troubles had destroyed her family relationships, and the loss of Marcus had broken something fundamental in her spirit. "I want to see him," Anna whispered. "Just once. Please." Clark's expression was stone. "Marcus will grow up knowing his mother tried to poison him for sex and money. He'll never know your name. I made mistakes, but I love him. You drugged an infant. You endangered his life. You forfeited any claim to love when you chose Luther over your son's safety." Anna began sobbing, but Clark felt nothing. She had crossed a line that erased any possibility of mercy or forgiveness. "You'll serve your sentence knowing that every day you're imprisoned is a day Marcus grows stronger and healthier without you. You'll know that your choice is destroyed, not just your life, but Luther's life and your family's legacy." As Clark left the prison, he carried with him the satisfaction of absolute justice. Anna and Luther's world hadn't just collapsed. It had been systematically destroyed by someone who understood that some betrayals demanded complete and permanent consequences. Marcus was safe. The threats to his family had been eliminated, and everyone who had participated in the conspiracy against his son would spend years understanding the true cost of their actions. Chapter 6. The Foundation of the Future. 6 months after Anna's sentencing to 12 years in federal prison, Clark stood in the nursery of his new home, watching Marcus take his first steps. The baby who had been systematically sedated and neglected was now a healthy, vibrant toddler whose development had accelerated once the poisoning ended. Clark had built this new house specifically for his son's future, a fortress of technology and security that would protect Marcus from any future threats. Every room was monitored, every entrance secured, every detail designed to ensure that no one could ever again harm his child without immediate detection. But security was only part of Clark's long-term strategy. He was building something larger, a legacy that would protect Marcus and future generations of the Winter family from the kind of betrayal that had nearly destroyed them. Dennis Hyde arrived for their weekly security briefing, carrying updates on the continued destruction of Clark's enemies. Luther's appeal was denied, Dennis reported. He's serving his 20 years in federal maximum security. No possibility of parole before 15 years. And Anna? Medical reports indicate she's struggling with long-term health effects from prescription drug withdrawal. Her family has completely disowned her. The Adams Trust has been restructured to exclude her permanently. Clark nodded, absorbing the information without emotion. William Lindsay? Convicted on all federal charges. 15 years, complete asset forfeiture. The Lindsay Development Group has been liquidated to pay restitution. The family name is professionally dead. Clark picked up Marcus, who giggled and reached for his father's face. The contrast between this healthy, happy child and the sedated infant Anna had been maintaining was stark evidence of how close they had come to tragedy. There's something else, Dennis continued. Isabel Ewing from the prosecutor's office wants to meet with you. Isabel Ewing was the federal prosecutor who had built the cases against Luther and his father. Clark had worked with her extensively, providing evidence and testimony that had ensured their convictions. What does she want? She's building a task force focused on white-collar crime networks. She thinks your investigative work could be valuable for future cases. Clark considered this carefully. Working with federal prosecutors would provide him with resources and legal protection for future operations. It would also give him access to information about potential threats before they could develop. Schedule the meeting. That afternoon, Clark met Isabel Ewing at a secure conference room in the federal building. Isabel was in her 40s, with the focused intensity of someone who had built her career destroying criminals who thought wealth made them untouchable. Mr. Winter, Isabel began, your investigative work on the Lindsay conspiracy was exceptional. The evidence you provided was comprehensive enough to secure convictions without lengthy trials. I protect my family, Clark said simply. Whatever resources were necessary, I used them. We like to formalize that relationship. There are other networks like the Lindsays, wealthy families using insider information, prescription fraud rings, child endangerment cases hidden by money and social position. Clark leaned forward. What are you proposing? Consulting work. You'd have federal resources for investigations, legal protection for your methods, and access to intelligence about potential threats. In exchange, you'd help us build cases against networks that regular law enforcement can't penetrate. Why me? Because you understand how these people think, and you're willing to use methods that law enforcement can't officially employ. The Lindsay case showed that you can systematically destroy criminal networks through legal pressure, financial manipulation, and social isolation. Clark considered the offer. Working with federal law enforcement would provide legitimacy for his methods, while giving him resources to protect Marcus from future threats. It would also allow him to identify and eliminate dangers before they could develop. I'll consider it. That evening, Clark called Salvatore Bond to discuss the proposition. Federal consulting work, Salvatore mused. Legal cover for operations, access to intelligence networks, official protection for unconventional methods, and the ability to identify threats early, Clark added. If there are other networks like the Lindsays out there, I want to know about them before they can target my family. You're thinking long-term. I'm thinking about Marcus's future. I want him to inherit a world where the Winter name means something that can't be threatened or destroyed. Clark's phone buzzed with a message from his construction company foreman. A new project was ready to begin. The Winter Family Trust Building, a 20-story office complex that would house Clark's business operations and provide income for future generations. But this wasn't just a business venture. Clark was building an empire that would protect his bloodline from the kind of betrayal he'd experienced. Every business relationship would be carefully vetted, every employee thoroughly investigated, every potential threat identified and neutralized before it could develop. He was also planning Marcus's education, not just traditional schooling, but training in the kinds of skills Clark had used to destroy Anna and Luther. Investigation techniques, financial analysis, strategic planning, and the ruthless application of consequences for betrayal. Marcus would grow up understanding that the world was full of people who would try to use him, steal from him, or harm him for their own benefit. But Marcus would also grow up with the tools and resources to destroy anyone who made that mistake. As Clark tucked Marcus into bed that night, he made a promise to his son that went beyond typical parental protection. "You'll never be vulnerable the way I was," Clark whispered. "You'll never trust the wrong people or assume loyalty where none exists. And anyone who tries to hurt you will learn what happened to the last people who made that mistake." Marcus smiled and reached for his father's hand, unaware that his future was being built on the systematic destruction of those who had threatened his safety. Clark's transformation was complete. The successful businessman who had once believed in loyalty and trust had become something harder, more dangerous, and absolutely protective of his bloodline. He had learned that in a world full of predators, the only safety came from being the most dangerous predator of all. The foundation for Marcus's future was built on the ruins of Anna and Luther's lives, and Clark intended to keep building until no threat could ever reach his family again. Chapter 7. The Network Expands. 2 years after Anna's conviction, Clark had transformed his role as federal consultant into something approaching legend among law enforcement circles. His methods for dismantling criminal networks were studied at FBI training seminars, and his success rate in building prosecutable cases was unprecedented. Marcus, now 3 years old, was developing into a sharp, observant child who already showed signs of his father's analytical mind. Clark had begun teaching him basic observation skills disguised as games, identifying inconsistencies in stories, recognizing when people were lying, understanding the importance of documentation and evidence. Isabel Ewing arrived at Clark's office for their quarterly review meeting, carrying files on their latest successful prosecution. "The Rollins prescription fraud network is completely dismantled," Isabel reported. 16 convictions, including 3 doctors and 2 pharmacy owners. Their operation was generating $2 million annually in illegal prescription sales. Clark reviewed the case summary. The Rollins network had been similar to Anna's operation. Wealthy individuals using multiple medical sources to obtain controlled substances, often to facilitate other criminal activities. Clark's investigation had systematically identified every participant, every transaction, and every vulnerability in their operation. "Mercedes Rollins is facing 25 years, Isabel continued. "Her medical license is permanently revoked, her assets are frozen, and her family's pharmaceutical business is under federal oversight." What about the connected networks? That's where it gets interesting. Mercedes Rollins had connections to Luther Lindsay's operation. They were sharing doctors and using similar prescription fraud techniques. "We're finding that these networks are more connected than we initially realized." Clark leaned back in his chair. This was the pattern he'd begun to identify through his federal consulting work. Wealthy criminal networks weren't isolated operations. They were interconnected systems that shared resources, techniques, and protection mechanisms. "I want to see the connection analysis." Isabel spread out a network diagram showing relationships between various criminal operations they'd investigated. The Lindsay Insider trading network connected to prescription fraud rings. The prescription fraud rings connected to money laundering operations. The money laundering operations connected to child exploitation networks. "It's an ecosystem," Clark observed. "Each network provides services to the others, creating mutual protection and shared resources." Exactly. And we think there's a central coordination mechanism, someone or some organization that facilitates these connections. Clark studied the diagram with the same intensity he applied to construction blueprints. The pattern was clear once you understood the architecture. These weren't random criminal operations. They were components of a larger system. "I want to investigate the coordination layer." "Clark, that would mean going after people with significant resources and protection. We're talking about individuals who might have federal connections, political influence, international resources." "Good," Clark said simply. "I want Marcus to inherit a world where those people have been eliminated." Over the following months, Clark's investigation into the criminal coordination networks led him to a discovery that changed everything. The connections weren't accidental. They were managed by an organization called the Meridian Group, an exclusive society of wealthy individuals who facilitated criminal operations while maintaining legitimacy through charitable foundations and social connections. The Meridian Group operated like a high-end criminal consulting firm. They provided legal protection, political influence, resource sharing, and operational security for their members' illegal activities. Membership required significant wealth, political connections, and commitment to mutual protection. Dennis Hyde's investigation revealed that Anna's affair with Luther hadn't been a spontaneous romance. It had been facilitated by Meridian Group connections. Anna's prescription fraud had been guided by Meridian resources. The planned destruction of Clark's business had been coordinated through Meridian financial networks. They identified you as a target because your construction business was interfering with Meridian development projects, Dennis explained. Anna was recruited specifically to destroy you from within. Clark felt something cold and focused settle into his mind. Anna's betrayal hadn't been personal weakness. It had been enemy action by an organization that viewed his family as obstacles to their criminal operations. Who runs the Meridian Group? That's where it gets complicated. The leadership structure is compartmentalized, with different cells handling different types of operations. But our intelligence suggests the primary coordination comes from someone with federal law enforcement connections. Clark immediately understood the implications. Someone within federal law enforcement was protecting and coordinating criminal networks. Someone with access to investigative information, prosecution strategies, and law enforcement resources. I want names. Clark, if we're right about federal connections, investigating this could be extremely dangerous. We're talking about people with the resources to make investigators disappear. Clark looked out his office window at the city below, where Marcus was spending the afternoon with his carefully vetted caretakers in their secure home. Dennis, 2 years ago, someone tried to destroy my family through systematic fraud and child abuse. I eliminated that threat completely. Now I'm discovering that threat was part of a larger organization that specifically targeted my son. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, Clark said, his voice carrying the same cold certainty it had held when he'd planned Anna and Luther's destruction, that the Meridian Group has made the same mistake Anna and Luther made. They've threatened my family. This isn't like going after Anna and Luther. The Meridian Group has resources, connections, political protection. And I have something they don't expect, Clark interrupted. I have nothing left to lose and everything to protect. Anna and Luther thought they were dealing with a businessman. The Meridian Group thinks they're dealing with a federal consultant. Clark stood and walked to his safe, removing files he'd been preparing for months. They have no idea they're actually dealing with someone who views their existence as a threat to his child's future. What do you need from me? Everything. Financial records, communication intercepts, travel patterns, security details, family connections. I want to know every member, every operation, every protection mechanism. And then, Clark's smile was the same expression he'd worn when planning Anna's destruction, but colder and more focused. And then I'm going to teach the Meridian Group what happens when organizations threaten the Winter family. Dennis gathered his files and headed for the door, then paused. Clark, once you start this, there won't be any going back. You'll be at war with people who have unlimited resources. Good, Clark said. They should have thought about that before they sent Anna to poison my son. As Dennis left, Clark called Salvatore Bond and Isabel Ewing for an emergency meeting. The Meridian Group's existence changed everything. They weren't just dealing with isolated criminal operations. They were facing an organized enemy that had specifically targeted his family. But Clark Winter had spent 2 years learning how to destroy criminal networks systematically and permanently. The Meridian Group was about to discover that their greatest mistake hadn't been targeting Clark's business or his marriage. Their greatest mistake had been teaching Clark Winter that the world was full of organizations that would try to destroy his family, and that the only protection was to destroy them first. Chapter 8. The Meridian War. The war against the Meridian Group began with the systematic identification of every member, every operation, and every protection mechanism they'd built over decades of criminal coordination. Clark approached it like the largest construction project of his career. Careful planning, resource allocation, and methodical execution of a design meant to last forever. Working with Isabel Ewing and a carefully selected team of federal investigators, Clark had spent 6 months mapping the Meridian Group's structure. What they discovered was more extensive than anyone had imagined. A network of over 200 members spanning law enforcement, politics, business, and entertainment, all coordinating criminal operations while maintaining public legitimacy. The group's leadership structure was revealed through financial analysis and communication intercepts. At the center was Anthony Hardin, a former federal prosecutor who had used his law enforcement connections to build a criminal empire. Hardin coordinated operations through a network of regional lieutenants, each managing specific criminal specialties: financial fraud, prescription networks, political corruption, and what they euphemistically called family restructuring. Anna's recruitment and the planned destruction of Clark's family had been a family restructuring operation, the systematic elimination of individuals whose business success interfered with Meridian Group interests. Hardin has been using federal investigative resources to identify targets, Isabel explained during their secure briefing. He accesses investigation files, prosecution strategies, and law enforcement intelligence to protect Meridian operations while targeting their enemies. Clark studied the organizational chart with the same focus he'd applied to Anna's destruction, but the scale was enormously larger. The Meridian Group had resources, political connections, and protection mechanisms that made Luther Lindsay's family wealth look insignificant. How do we dismantle something this large? We don't dismantle it, Clark said. We destroy it completely. Salvatore Bond had been recruiting resources for months, building a network of investigators, financial analysts, and tactical specialists. But this operation required something beyond Salvatore's usual capabilities. We need federal protection and legal authority, Salvatore reported. The Meridian Group has connections in local law enforcement, state politics, and federal agencies. Traditional investigation methods will be compromised. Clark had anticipated this problem. Isabel, I want to propose something unprecedented. What did you have in mind? A joint federal task force with complete operational security. Handpicked personnel with no prior federal connections, unlimited investigative authority, and legal protection for unconventional methods. Isabel considered the proposal carefully. You're talking about a black operation with federal legitimacy. I'm talking about the systematic destruction of a criminal organization that has infiltrated federal law enforcement. Normal methods won't work because they control normal methods. Over the following weeks, Clark and Isabel assembled their task force. 20 investigators, analysts, and tactical specialists, all carefully vetted and completely isolated from standard federal bureaucracy. Their base of operations was Clark's construction company headquarters, modified with security measures that rivaled federal facilities. The task force's first target was Russell Riley, the doctor who had discovered Anna's systematic sedation of Marcus. Riley had become a key witness in multiple Meridian prosecutions, and Clark had learned through intelligence intercepts that the Meridian Group was planning to eliminate him. They can't allow Riley to continue testifying, Clark explained to his team. His medical evidence is destroying their prescription fraud networks. But instead of simply protecting Riley, Clark planned to use the Meridian Group's assassination attempt as the first phase of their destruction. We let them come for Riley, Clark said, but we're ready for them. Every person involved in the assassination attempt becomes evidence against the larger organization. The operation required precise timing and overwhelming force. Riley was moved to a secure medical facility that appeared vulnerable, but was actually a trap containing recording equipment, surveillance systems, and tactical teams. When a Meridian Group's assassination team arrived, they walked into a carefully prepared ambush. Every member was captured alive, every communication was recorded, and every piece of equipment was cataloged as evidence. But Clark's true victory came during the interrogations. The assassination team members, facing federal terrorism charges, provided detailed information about Meridian Group operations, command structures, and future plans. They're planning to expand into child trafficking, one assassin revealed during interrogation. Anthony Hardin has connections with international networks. They want to use prescription fraud and family restructuring operations to identify vulnerable children. The revelation that the Meridian Group was planning to expand into child trafficking transformed Clark's mission from business protection to something more fundamental: the elimination of a threat to children everywhere, including his son. No more careful investigation, Clark announced to his task force. We move to direct action against every Meridian Group member simultaneously. What followed was the largest coordinated law enforcement operation in federal history. Simultaneous raids on over 200 locations, coordinated arrests of Meridian Group members, and the seizure of assets worth over $2 billion. Anthony Hardin was arrested in his federal office, where he'd been using government resources to coordinate criminal operations. The evidence against him was overwhelming: recorded communications, financial records, testimony from dozens of co-conspirators. But Clark's personal satisfaction came from the arrest of Dr. Maurice Sanford, one of the doctors who had been providing Anna with prescription medications. Dr. Sanford had been recruited by the Meridian Group specifically to facilitate family restructuring operations through systematic child sedation. She was supposed to provide medical cover if your son had died from the sedation, Isabel reported. The plan was to claim sudden infant death syndrome while covering up the systematic poisoning. Clark felt the same cold fury he'd experienced when discovering Anna's betrayal, but magnified by the understanding that Marcus's life had been threatened by an entire organization. What's her sentence? Life without parole. Child endangerment with conspiracy to commit murder. She'll die in federal prison. The Meridian Group's destruction was complete within 6 months. Anthony Hardin received multiple life sentences. Regional lieutenants were sentenced to decades in federal prison. Financial assets were seized and distributed to victims of their operations. But Clark's final act of justice was personal. He arranged for Anna and Luther to learn, through prison communications, that their affair had been orchestrated by the Meridian Group as part of a plan to murder Marcus and steal Clark's business assets. They used you. Clark had Dennis report to Anna through her prison attorney. Your affair wasn't love, it was enemy action. Luther wasn't your soulmate, he was your handler. And the plan always ended with Marcus's death. Anna's psychological collapse was complete when she realized that everything she believed about her relationship with Luther had been manipulation by an organization that viewed her as expendable. Luther's response was rage that turned to despair when he understood that his 20-year sentence was the result of being recruited as a disposable asset in someone else's criminal operation. Clark felt no sympathy for either of them. They had chosen to participate in a conspiracy against his family, regardless of their motivations or understanding. As Clark read the final reports of the Meridian Group prosecutions, Marcus played with construction toys in the corner of his office, building elaborate structures and then carefully dismantling them. What are you building, son? Clark asked. Houses, Marcus replied with 3-year-old seriousness. But first I have to make sure they're safe from bad people. Clark smiled, recognizing something of himself in his son's methodical approach to construction and security. The war against the Meridian Group was over, but Clark's mission continued. Somewhere, other organizations were planning to threaten innocent families. Other children were being targeted by criminals who viewed them as obstacles to profit. Clark Winter had learned that the world was full of predators, but he'd also learned that systematic preparation and ruthless application of consequences could eliminate those predators permanently. Marcus would inherit a world where the Winter name meant something that couldn't be threatened or destroyed. And anyone who forgot that lesson would learn what had happened to Anna, Luther, Anthony Hardin, and the Meridian Group. Chapter 9. The Legacy. 5 years after the destruction of the Meridian Group, Clark Winter stood in the boardroom of Winter and Associates, addressing a gathering of federal law enforcement officials, business leaders, and international investigators. The walls displayed photographs from dozens of successful operations, criminal networks dismantled, children protected, and threats eliminated. Marcus, now 8 years old, sat quietly in the corner with his tutor, occasionally glancing up from his advanced mathematics workbook to observe the adults discussing complex investigations. Clark had begun involving his son in appropriate aspects of their security operations, teaching him the importance of vigilance, preparation, and systematic thinking. The Winter Protocol, as federal agencies had named Clark's methodology, had become the standard approach for dismantling sophisticated criminal networks. The systematic identification of vulnerabilities, coordinated pressure campaigns, and complete elimination of threats had proven effective against organizations from international trafficking networks to domestic terrorism cells. Isabel Ewing, now director of the Federal Criminal Networks Task Force, presented their latest success statistics. Using Winter Protocol methodology, we've dismantled 43 major criminal organizations in the past 5 years, Isabel reported. Asset seizures have exceeded $8 billion, and we've prevented an estimated 1,200 serious crimes, including kidnapping, trafficking, and murder. Clark listened with satisfaction, but his attention was focused on the future rather than past achievements. The federal consulting work had served its purpose, establishing legal authority for his methods, while providing resources to eliminate threats to his family. But Clark's long-term vision extended beyond law enforcement. He was building something larger and more permanent, a network of investigators, analysts, and tactical specialists dedicated to protecting innocent families from criminal organizations. The Winter Foundation operated as a charitable organization funding crime prevention programs, but its real purpose was the systematic identification and elimination of threats before they could develop. After the federal officials departed, Clark remained in the boardroom with Marcus, who had finished his mathematics assignment and was now studying surveillance footage from their latest investigation. "What do you see?" Clark asked his son. Marcus pointed to details in the footage that most adults would miss: timing patterns in the suspect's movements, coordination between different individuals, subtle communication signals between team members. "They're working together," Marcus observed, "but they don't trust each other. Look how they position themselves to watch each other while watching for threats." Clark nodded approvingly. Marcus was developing the analytical skills that would protect him throughout his life, but more importantly, he was learning to see the world as it really was, full of people whose loyalty couldn't be assumed and whose intentions required constant verification. What would you do about them? Marcus considered the question with the seriousness of someone much older. Document everything first. Find out who they work for and who they're planning to hurt. Then stop them before they can hurt anyone. And if they've already hurt people, then they need to understand that actions have consequences, Marcus replied, unconsciously echoing the philosophy that had guided Clark's destruction of Anna, Luther, and the Meridian Group. Clark's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Dennis Hyde, who now managed international operations for the Winter Foundation. A new threat had been identified: a network of criminals targeting military families whose deployments left children vulnerable to exploitation. "I need to take care of some business," Clark told Marcus. "What's your assessment of our security here?" Marcus quickly scanned the room, identifying exits, sight lines, potential weapons, and communication options with the automatic efficiency of someone who had been trained from infancy to think defensively. "Secure," Marcus concluded, "but I should review the updated threat assessments before tonight." "Good. And remember, trust is earned through actions, not words," Marcus recited. "Documentation is protection. Preparation prevents vulnerability. And anyone who threatens our family will learn what happened to the others." As Clark prepared to leave for his meeting with Dennis, he reflected on the transformation his life had undergone since discovering Anna's betrayal. The successful businessman who had once believed in loyalty and trust had become something harder, more dangerous, and absolutely protective of his bloodline. But more importantly, he had built a legacy that would protect Marcus and future generations of the Winter family. Every criminal organization they dismantled made the world safer for innocent families. Every threat they eliminated meant fewer children would suffer what Marcus had endured during those months of systematic sedation. Anna was serving the 7th year of her 12-year sentence, her health destroyed by prescription drug withdrawal and the psychological trauma of realizing she'd been manipulated into poisoning her own son. Luther was halfway through his 20-year sentence, his appeals exhausted and his family name permanently destroyed. Anthony Hardin had died in federal prison 2 years earlier, killed by inmates who learned he'd been planning to traffic children. The other Meridian group members who had survived their sentences lived in constant fear that their past actions would be discovered by fellow prisoners. Clark felt no satisfaction in their suffering, only the cold certainty that justice had been served and threats had been eliminated. His phone rang with a call from Grace Adams Pugh, Anna's grandmother and the current head of the Adams Family Trust. "Clark," Grace said, her elderly voice still sharp with authority. "I wanted to inform you that the trust has established a scholarship fund in Marcus's name. It will provide education funding for children who have survived family abuse situations." "That's generous, Grace. It's appropriate. The Adams family failed Marcus when we failed to protect him from Anna's actions. This is our attempt to ensure other children receive the protection Marcus deserved." After the call ended, Clark looked out his office window at the city below, where Marcus was safely attending his private school under discreet but comprehensive security protection. The world was still full of people who would try to use, steal from, or harm innocent families. But it was also full of people like Grace Adams Pugh, Isabel Ewing, and the federal investigators who had chosen to fight against criminal networks rather than profit from them. Clark Winter had learned that the only protection from predators was to become a more dangerous predator. But he had also learned that systematic preparation, ruthless application of consequences, and absolute commitment to protecting innocence could eliminate threats permanently. Marcus would inherit a world where the Winter name meant something that couldn't be threatened or destroyed. He would also inherit the knowledge, skills, and resources necessary to protect that legacy against any future threats. As Clark prepared to leave for his meeting with Dennis about the military family trafficking network, he made the same promise he'd made every day since Anna's arrest. Anyone who threatened his family would learn what had happened to Anna, Luther, Anthony Hardin, and the Meridian Group. The Winter legacy was built on the systematic destruction of those who preyed on innocence, and Clark intended to keep building until no threat could ever reach his family again. Some betrayals could never be forgiven. Some actions demanded permanent consequences, and some legacies were worth any price to protect. Clark Winter had paid that price, and Marcus Winter would inherit a world made safer by his father's ruthless commitment to justice. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there.